Well, this is Origins of Our Faith. My name is Rick Richardson. Thanks for being with me on another program. I thought today we would talk about a subject that tends to be little talked about when you're talking about beliefs, especially within Christianity, and that is the lost tribes of Israel. It is probably one of the most important topics that we find about in the pages of the Bible. In fact, the Bible really centers around this particular event about the tribes being lost and about them being at the end of the age returning and once again joining with the two or three remaining tribes, the house of Judah, and then bringing in an era of peace at the end of the age. So that's what the entire book really focuses on, these events, and yet we spend very little time talking about it. The Lost 10 Tribes are one of the legends throughout history, where a lot of things have been talked about and have been just a whole lot of folklore has come up over the years throughout the, in fact, Middle Ages. There was a belief that the lost tribes were beyond a river, I think it was called Sibaton, and it was a river that couldn't be forged because it would only be calm on the Sabbath. And as the legend goes, the tribes were so righteous they wouldn't travel, they wouldn't work on the Sabbath, and therefore, whenever it was calm, they couldn't cross because it was only calm during the Sabbath. And then it would get rough and they wouldn't be able to get across. And they've been on the other side of this river ever since. Well, that's obviously folklore and legend and something that is just a fancy tale. But what do we know? What do we know about the lost 10 tribes of Israel, that northern kingdom that disappeared from the face of the earth? One thing that's amazing is when you stop and think about how the nation of Israel, modern Israel today, is really a nation that came out of nowhere. There were a certain amount of people that we knew as Jewish people here and there, but the language, the Hebrew language, had pretty much become a dead language. It wasn't spoken. There wasn't much as far as new linguistics being studied as far as Hebrew goes. And it wasn't until the nation then formed again in 1948, and it was decided that, yes, we should have Hebrew as the national language, and everybody should speak Hebrew. Well, up until that point, nobody spoke it. Maybe it was spoken in prayers at synagogues, but that was it. It just wasn't a used language at all anywhere. And so for a nation to come out of nowhere with an entirely new language or restored language is an amazing feat. But nothing, not even that, compares to what prophecies say will happen in the future. And that is when the lost 10 tribes return from virtually nowhere. They have been lost through history. They have been, and that's why they're called the lost tribes. Nobody knows where they are. For all practical purposes, they don't exist. And yet the Bible tells us at the end of the age, they will return. One of the things that you find interesting is even when you look into the pages of the Bible, and you find it was from really the earliest parts of Israel coming out of Egypt as a nation, that God foretells that they will be thrown into exile, and at the end of the age they will come back. We find in Deuteronomy 30 and verse 1 it says, "And when you and your children return to the Lord your God and obey with all your heart and with all your soul according to everything that I command you today, then the Lord your God will restore you and your fortunes, and have compassion on you, and gather you again from all the nations from which you were scattered." So this is before they even came into the promised land. This is when they were wandering in the desert in Sinai that God says, you know what? You are going to leave, you're going to forget me, and one day you will return, and I will gather you in from all the nations from which you've been scattered. And certainly that has happened, but not to the extent, really, that prophecy talks about it happening. Whether we read Jeremiah or Isaiah or Ezekiel or Zechariah, they all talk about a time at the end of the age when the northern kingdom returns from exile. And as Jeremiah says, this will be a time that will make the first Exodus look like small potatoes. It's going to look like nothing. It says, no longer will you say the God who brought us out of the land of Egypt, but you will recall the God that brought us from the four corners of the earth when God returns the northern kingdom, the lost 10 tribes, from exile. Now, we find in certain books, the book of Ezekiel being one, where he talks about this happening. And in chapter 37, it begins with the story of the Valley of Dry Bones. And this valley is just a bunch of bones. There's nobody's there. And all of a sudden, all the bones start to come together, and skin and muscle and all sorts of other things that compose a body all come together. And here, standing before Ezekiel, is an entire army of people, just a vast number of people. And he says, well, who are these? Where do they come from? And the answer is, they are the house of Israel. And they came from the four corners of the earth, from different places where they were exiled, different places where they had lost their identity. God says, I will make you not a people in Hosea. And then they will be his people. So, a very curious thing, that at the end of the age, these people come from nowhere. Well, again, that's what prophecies say, but before we get to before we get to that end point, we need to go back in time a little bit just to understand who they are. Well, to really begin the story, we need to go back to the book of Kings at a time when Israel was a nation and they were on their way to become somewhat more substantial than they had been. David had been king after Saul, and then Solomon was king after him, and he built the temple. Great accomplishment, and people came from all over the world to come and look at this amazing building that Solomon had built for God. And so it was a time that Israel had great power and might, but it came with a cost. It came with a lot of taxes and a lot of hard work and a lot of labor to get it to the point that it was. But when Solomon died, it came time for the people to come together and say to his son Rehoboam, things have been tough. It's been hard. We've been worked to death. And we don't want to be under so much burden anymore. Well, it is surprising what happened, because you would think this would be a time that everybody would take a breather and say, let's enjoy all the prosperity that we have. But that didn't happen. We'll take a short break and continue the story when we get back on Origins of Our Faith.